So what is the situation of energy for the poor today? We've got about 2.4 billion people who still use traditional biomass fuels for cooking. Right? That's 2.4 out of about 6.5 billion people on the planet. 1.6 billion people still don't have access to electricity. So that first line, those 2.4 billion are doing environmental damage through the local deforestation that I've talked about. They're also hurting their health in the ways that Josh has described. You know, I've been to Africa many times, and one of the very common scenes that you see is a mother with her baby strapped on her back as she's doing her cooking indoors with a biomass, using fuel, using wood to cook. Biomass could be fuel wood, it could also be residues from crops, and it could also be dung from your animals. And as she's doing all this cooking, particles go into the air and, of course, into her baby's nose. And that's why acute lower respiratory infection, or different classes of pneumonia, is the second killer of African children after diarrheal disease. And it still kills about 1 million children in Africa a year. Okay? So the poor require access to all of these things to improve their welfare. That's clear. The progress in this has been dramatic in Asia. Right? That's just the populations that lack electrification, and the region that's gone through a dramatic transformation recently has been East Asia, thanks mostly to China. 1980, you see more than 800 million people without access to electricity, down to something like 100 million today. But South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa still have about 1.6 billion people that need to be plugged in, and to allow families to go through this transformative change. All right. And we've talked, previous speakers have talked about cook stoves, and you'll have another speaker next week about that, so I'll just gloss over this. But the cook stove revolution is, in fact, transformative for these families, not only for the environment, for the reasons that I've spoken about, and not only for their health, but also because of the time release of the people who are collecting the fuel wood in the first place, usually the children. Right? And the parts of the world that are still using most biomass the most is Sub-Saharan Africa, as I pointed out. And here's that interesting graph that tells you how much time we're actually talking about. On the right, you see the time use of an average female in Tanzania. Okay? And the axis is a little hard to understand. It's tons kilometers, but which I'll translate in a second. That bottom bar is for water collection, and the second one is for fuel wood collection. They're both about 30 ton kilometers a year. So if you imagine a little girl carrying 10 kilograms worth of things, or 22 pounds of water or fuel wood, if you do the calculation, she's walking 10 kilometers a day, or 6.2 miles a day, every single day of the year. If she's carrying more, 20 kilograms, then she's still walking 3.2 miles every single day. Imagine a little girl carrying, 44 pounds of wood or water in total, for a total of 3.2 miles every single day instead of going to school. That's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for the rest of her life, because there's tons of evidence that tells us that if you miss school and the human capital formation in young age, you're never going to get that back. And when you go out into the competitive marketplace to try to get a job, you decide to migrate to Nairobi and try to find a job. If you're uneducated, if you're illiterate, if you're innumerate, you won't be able to access the wages that some of your peers can access, and you'll be stuck in poverty. Right? Why? Because your time was sucked up throughout your entire childhood being a beast of burden for your family. So we need energy for water. I gave you the example there. Still, 780 million people in the world lack access to water. 2.5 billion lack access to good sanitation. That also translates into education, because 1 in 10 African girls drop out of school, or don't go to school during menstruation, or drop out of school completely at puberty, because there's no private and clean sanitation facility at the school. And so again, you're cutting off a child's future because of a lack of access to infrastructure, to energy. And unless you're lucky and live in a hilly area with a spring and you can use gravity to bring that water to you, you're going to need energy to pump that water out of the ground or bring it from the nearest lake or pond or river. All right? Of course, we're going to need energy for public services, as I described. Public services like clinics, for example. You know, if you're the rural doctor or the rural midwife and a woman goes into labor in the middle of the night and has complications, try doing that without any light. That's hard. How do you go through, think about immunization campaigns or antibiotics that require a cold chain when you don't have refrigeration? You don't. Without energy for refrigeration, you can't get the antibiotics that require cold chains or the vaccines that require cold chains out to these populations. Now, the Secretary General of the United Nations is pushing the international community to try to get universal access to energy by the year 2030. And here's the piece of the good news is that the engineers of the world are the rate of innovation for solutions to the energy problem of large parts of the developing world is astounding. In fact, we think that 55% of the additional electricity that we need to provide if we're going to get universal access to energy is going to come through off-grid solutions. That means that we're not just extending the electric grid to cover more people. It means that people are just too far from the conventional infrastructure that we have in Africa, from the usual grid, so we're going to have to find ways to get energy out to them and energy that's produced there. That can be renewable in a lot of cases, lots of new solar technology that's deployable in Africa, or it can be a diesel pump, a traditional fossil fuel-based a diesel engine. All right, so what's the trap that we're talking about? You start out in poverty. If you're poor, you can't afford modern energy sources that would save you time, so you choose instead to consume biomass, this fuel, or that we've been talking about for cooking. That biomass was cut down from a local forest, so that leads to environmental degradation. Increased environmental degradation means the next time you need some wood, you're going to have to walk further to go get it, and successfully continuing. The further you walk to go get it, the less time your child has to go to school. And that's going to keep her in poverty for the rest of her life. So the poverty gets exacerbated. Meanwhile, the fact that you're using this fuel wood to cook makes you sick, right? If you're sick, it means you can't go to work. It means you're going to have all of the consequences that Josh talked about earlier. And it means you might have to spend the few resources you have to go see a doctor, which means you don't have resources for other things you might need, like clothing, like shelter, like food. Again, keeping you trapped in poverty. So given this dynamic, what we call a vicious cycle, it's not only hard to analyze and understand and measure, as Josh described. It's hard to talk about the value of energy. It's also hard to teach and to describe to students. And so I thought I'd end by showing you a pedagogical tool that I've developed to teach complex systems like this. And what we did with colleagues at Columbia University is to design a simulation of an African village. Right? And the simulation environment allows undergraduates who have never been to a sub-Saharan African country to experience the constraints that these families are operating under. These students have to decide how to allocate their time. They could spend time farming or fishing at the local lake. They could go collect water. They can go collect fuel wood. They could choose to go to the doctor. They can choose to have a child. They can choose to spend money to buy fertilizer or seeds or an anti-malarial bed net. The village can choose to tax itself to some extent and then perhaps improve the road that takes you to the local town where you can sell your crops. The real life decisions that these villages have to make. And the students, unfortunately, find that it's very, very, very hard to do well because we've calibrated it as realistically as we can. Right? And in particular, what I'd like to emphasize is a big part of the decision-making process for the student is to think about how to allocate time across all of these necessary activities. And, well, that's the complexity of the system. Again, why it's hard to teach for those of you who've done any economics, and we try to write down equations in to describe very, very simple versions of the world, and that's how we begin to teach. But when you're talking about a very complex system with all of these arrows pointing in all of these directions, quickly it becomes an intractable problem in a mathematical sense and very hard to teach an undergraduate. And that's why exiting the traditional blackboard and using computers to design a complex system simulation that lets the student directly experience the dynamic that we're talking about is of value. We overlay on that all sorts of information. So if the student wants to dive deeper into, well, what exactly is drip irrigation? I've heard of it, but we provide all of that background information with all the underlying statistics for fuel wood collection or whatever it is. We'll link to all the bibliography. That's the usual benefits of today's age, computerized age. We allow the students to analyze the data of the system. So every moment, everything is being recorded. And since we're teaching them to become social scientists, not only do we want them to experience the African experience that we say, but we say analyze the data from what you've done and try to understand the relationships between the health of the family, the productivity of the land, things like that. And, relevant to today's talk, see how the evolution of time use changes with technology. So you might say at the beginning, where you're spending a whole lot of time on 3 activities. You're farming to stay alive, and you're spending all of the rest of your time collecting water and collecting fuel wood, and that's your day. As the environmental degradation gets worse, you've got to spend more time collecting fuel wood because the fuel wood's further away. That's cutting into your time to farm. And as your time for farming goes down, that means your yields are going to go down and you're going to be hungry. If instead you manage to get your hands on an improved wood stove that uses less fuel wood, well, that opens up time for you. You now spend far less time. The red part of the pie is the time collecting fuel wood. You need less fuel wood now. That's opened up opportunities for, say, running a small business, having a small store that sells something, or leisure in green. With a propane stove, you don't need to collect fuel wood at all. So that entire part of your time use, the red part of the pie, is completely gone. Now you've got much more time to run a small business. And if you have a water pump installed in the village, all of the time that you spent collecting water is now not necessary. So you've ended up spending your time farming, a lot more time investing in your small business, which generates income, and you have much more leisure time to spend with your children and to engage in other pursuits. Your overall level of human happiness has improved because of access to energy for cooking and for water. Right? So I should conclude because I'm over time, but the basic point is twofold. The poor need energy, right? And that energy is going to be transformative and necessary if we're going to achieve improvements in human welfare. At the global level, as we deal with global environmental challenges, we have decisions that we can make about what kind of energy we're going to be able to deploy, we're going to deploy. But regardless of what we decide, we need energy for the poor. And finally, just a plug for these kinds of new pedagogical tools for teaching complex systems like this, because I think that they're transformative in the classroom. Thank you very much.